Okay, welcome to actually one of my favorite chapters to teach, and this is all about antitrust, and I guess it's kind of weird, along with criminal law, which is pretty exciting and pretty interesting, I think, to look at. I like antitrust because even though all the chapters are very often starting off with the history of the common law and some of these historical roots, antitrust has such interesting roots in America, since interesting historical roots. And I'm going to include a couple cartoons, one or two of my favorite cartoons. And a word about cartoons. Of course, today we're kind of in a revival of cartoon culture, but historically, cartoons were very important, particularly with lower literacy rates and the absence of other mass media. Political cartoons had tremendous influences. One of the most corrupt mayors of New York, Boss Tweed, said, it's the cartoons that are drawing all the pressure on me. It's the cartoons that are trying to ruin me. I don't care what stories reporters write. It's the cartoons that are killing me. So I'm going to show you just at least one in here when I start talking about trust and antitrust. But this section is really, it could be entitled Preserving the Free Market or Regulating the Free Market. It's kind of a contradiction in terms. Because one of the things that happens in some views of a capitalist society is a concentration of market power as time goes on in individual niche markets. So, for example, at the turn of the 20th century, we had a dozen or more automobile makers. We had Dodge was independent, GM later comes along, Ford, Chrysler, Hudson, Studebaker. You can go on and on and on and name these. And of course, by the time you get to the 1970s and 80s and you're looking at the American automobile market, you're really down to the big three, Chrysler, GM, and Ford. Now in the early 2000s, there's really only two Native American car companies that are large, and that's GM and Ford. Chrysler's a relatively small player in the market anymore. So you can talk about this concentration of power, and of course one of the fundamental ideas of the efficiency of capitalism is competition in the marketplace. And if there's just one firm or a firm that's cooperating with other firms and are not competing, then these efficiencies are lost. So we want an efficient free market. And one of the one of the ironic twists of capitalism is the more efficient you are, the more that you destroy your competitors and drive them out of business, the less efficient you have to be. So antitrust was really kind of set up to deal with some of these issues. So let's go into the history of it, of course, to start with. And we'll start with the common law. Old lawsuits that were filed in areas of monopolies, which is really what we're talking about with antitrust, and I'll explain where trusts come from in a moment, were called restraint on trades. There's really very little new under the law. A lot of things are recycled and new ways of looking at things are created so that we can take some of these older things and apply them to the modern world. Now, because restraint in trades was available, of course, there's a reaction to any action. Larger companies, famous companies such as Standard Oil in the United States, the railroad companies, formed legal trusts, and as I said, the most famous was the Standard Oil Trust, which was primarily engaged in the refining of oil. You have to remember the United States was the world's largest producer, the world's largest exporter, the world's largest market for oil. All of this pretty much was controlled by Standard Oil. There weren't a lot of different oil companies by the time Standard Oil Trust got done. It controlled more than 80% of the refinery market in the United States. And the way a trust is set up is you surrender theoretical control to a trustee. The trustee can set prices, production, distribution, pays profits to the original owner. By breaking it up, it avoided some of the old common law restraint on trade approaches. What happened was many parts of the country, not the parts of the country you might think, like New York or Chicago, today, which are kind of seen as the liberal and I don't like this word, but we'll use it, socialist parts of the country, those were actually bastions of conservative capitalism, particularly New York. So the people that became radicalized and tried to regulate these trusts, because the trusts were seen as very exploitive, were ironically the areas of the country today that are very conservative, particularly economically. A great example here is Oklahoma. Oklahoma is one of the reddest of the red states, but at the turn of the century, it had more chapters for the Socialist Party in the United States and had the most active Socialist Party in the United States. Um, because trusts were seen as this sort of pinnacle of capitalism that was extracting money from small producers, particularly small farmers, which were very powerful in many Midwestern states, and small producers. So they had some control at the local level, the state legislatures, so they passed various antitrust lawsuits. It didn't work out too well. The trusts were often able to avoid these state lawsuits, and they just continued to gain in power. Now, gradually the federal government was compelled to get involved in this, and this really begins with the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, the Sherman Antitrust Act was a creature of John Sherman, who was the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, the famous Civil War general. And there were two major sections of the Sherman Antitrust, and those major sections were Section 1, which banned the formation of monopolies. So it's really the process of it. And 2, monopoly power. So 1 tried to keep monopolies from forming, 2 tried to keep anybody from acting like a monopoly. Now, in theory, antitrust only applies if you cross state boundaries, because remember, the states had problems because trusts could cross state boundaries. So you had to go to the feds. Now, this next one is that cartoon I kind of promised you all. This is a very famous cartoon. It's from Puck. And you'll notice this is the Congress of the United States, and this is passed around the this is probably 1890, about the same time as Sherman Antitrust. And you can see all these money bags, literally bags of money, that are labeled Copper Trust, Standard Oil Trust, that's kind of the biggest one there, Sugar Trust, Iron Trust, Steel Beam Trust, there's the Nail Trust, Coal. There's all these different trusts that are really looking over Congress, and they're dwarfing the power of Congress. And this was the feeling, was that trusts were very much in charge. And you see echoes of this today. You see where people say, social media is a good example where we have a lot of concentration of power. Facebook has too much power. Google has too much power. Amazon has too much power. They're effectively monopolies. So you can see that in this cartoon, the people's entrance, which is this door on the second floor up there, is closed, but the entrance for the monopolist, it's open, and in are strutting these money bags. So Section 1 of Sherman Antitrust recognizes something. First of all, not all agreements between companies are necessarily bad. Some are beneficial to the general public. So let me give you a quick example. Let's suppose that the automobile companies got together and did safety research together, that they couldn't or wouldn't fund adequately research into electric cars, or research into regenerative brakes, or research into things like a non-exploding gas tank. I don't know, whatever we talk about. Well, an agreement to research a way to prevent cars from bursting into fire is good for the public. So in some cases, we're going to use, when companies get together, the rule of reason analysis. We'll look at the purpose of the agreement. We'll look at the relative powers of the players in the market. If they're very small, it's probably going to be not too bad. Does it affect competition? And are there any alternative means, anything that's less restrictive than banning it, or is it okay? Some things, however, we don't use rule of reason. We say these are just blatantly anti-competitive. They are per se, which essentially means automatic violations of Sherman Antitrust. Now, we're going to talk about horizontal and vertical. Horizontal are defined as agreements between two rival firms. Some of these are per se violations, some of these are not. Horizontal tends to be more per se violation. Price fixing. So if companies got together and they said, you charge this much, I'll charge the same amount, we won't compete on price. This is a per se violation. Group boycotts, refusal to deal with any other party. You know, you get together and you say, well, we'll just deal with each other. And that's a per se violation. Horizontal market divisions. This would be something like if Toyota said, okay, we'll sell only in New England, and Mercedes said, okay, we'll only sell in the middle states, and Cadillac said, okay, we'll only sell in Florida. That would be a division. That's a per se violation. Trade associations, um, these can grow into violations, but we tend to use rule of reasons. Joint ventures, if it's not price or market fixing, again, we look into it more. We use a rule of reason. Vertical restraints are a little bit different. I'm going to show you a slide of the different structures in a second. It might be a little bit clearer, but this is an agreement between suppliers or processors at different levels. So what you're trying to do, if you're making an end product, let's suppose you're making a chip, a computer chip, and you need very fine sand, and that sand has to be refined into glass before you can make it into the chip. I'm just making something up there. So what you would do is you would get an agreement. You would say, okay, we're going to buy all the sand from you, but when we do this, you have to sell it us at this price. Now sometimes this can actually go to where you own the production and you're vertically integrating a firm where you control the entire process. And there's a lot of debate economically whether that's good or bad, but it does give you advantages. But if you can control the different levels, you often can get a real advantage over your competitors. So here's a quick example. There's horizontal integration where you're purchasing companies in the same industry. That's generally per se violations. The one on the other side, vertical integration, and this is for meat processing, where you own the cattle, you own the slaughterhouse, you own the refrigerator cars, you own the warehouse, you own the meat packing, you own the delivery, and at the end of the day, you control the meat. Like I said, if you actually own those pieces, there's less of a problem. When you start to have agreements, like when you go to cattle owners and say, you'll only sell to us, or you'll sell at this price, and you go to slaughterhouse and you say, well, we're going to deliver X amount of cattle, which is a lot of cattle for you and keep you in business, but we're only going to take this price or else. And it might be you can't take somebody else's price or give them as cheap a price. Vertical violations, they can be violations. If there's customer restrictions to prevent local dealers from undercutting, that could be rule of reason. Retail resale price maintenance agreements, rule of reason. Refusal to deal, that's usually a per se violation. Refusal that will create anything that creates a monopoly power or fosters anti-competitive market, we get very suspicious of. All right, as I said, you have Section 1, which is setting up the monopoly. Section 2 is behaving like monopoly. So what can a monopoly do? Well, one of the most common tactics to monopolize is called predatory pricing. There is an economic cost to enter into any market. So if you're going to make, I don't care, anvils, there's a cost to setting up your anvil factory. There's a cost to getting the tool and die machines to make the anvils. There's a cost to hiring the skilled labor. So that's the entry cost for that business. If you know what that entry cost is and you have a lot of money, and if you set your prices low enough and lose money for a while, if the other companies don't have enough financial resources to survive, they go out of business. Now at that point, what you do is you raise your prices higher than they were to recoup your losses, but not so high that it makes economic sense for anyone to spend the money to re-enter the field. Or maybe they have the knowledge that if they re-enter the field, you're going to engage in predatory pricing again. This would allow someone to essentially drive competitors out of the market, raise prices, and recoup any losses from this predatory pricing. And it's actually a violation of Sherman Antitrust. Monopolization is the process of monopoly power in the relative marketplace. Now, sometimes you get these just because you're making a better product. If you get it by being better or having a better product or historical accident, that's not a violation of Sherman Antitrust. So there's some things that are just a better product. Um, you might, yeah, you can think of Oreo cookies. I don't care. Oreo cookies are better than Hydrox. Why do Oreo cookies control 70% of the black and white sugar cookie market? I'm making this up. Because it's just better than any other cookie made. So if you make something that's better and you get monopoly power that way, that's okay. Monopoly power can't be easily defined, of course. It relates, we have a market share test. We look and we say, you don't have to control 100% of the market. If you control 70% of the market, you're a monopoly. If there's a relevant product market that really matters, or a relevant geographical market, a sub-market, you can be a monopoly in those too. We do look at intent. Did you intend to create a monopoly? If you're just a really good businessman, it's not a crime. But did you engage in anti-competitive behavior? Predatory pricing being an example. Section 2 blocks any attempt to monopolize, and it's got to be a serious threat. Now, this was passed in 1890, and it didn't work all that well. It worked okay. Somewhat ironically, the first thing they did, the courts were extremely conservative in the 1890s, 1895s. So the Congress was a little bit more liberal in that sense, anti-monopoly. So they passed the Sherman, and ironically, the courts used things like Sherman and similar acts not against businesses but against labor unions. They would say, well, labor unions trying to create a monopoly, so we can use Sherman to shut it down. Also, very quickly after the 1890 Act, businesses reacted, and they came out with new ways to do things, like price discrimination, exclusionary practices where you only deal with me and not with you, mergers, sometimes mergers between equals, or yeah, there's multiple firms, but the people sitting on each firm's boards are the same. That's called an interlocking directorate. So the Clayton Act of 1914 tried to really fix some of those problems. Price discrimination, as I said, you can't discriminate for the purposes of destroying your competitor unless there's production cost issue, transportation cost issues, or other reasons. Now, if you're a small player in the marketplace, you can do it. If you're competing with someone else in good faith, that's fine. If there's a cost justification, it's okay, but you can't do it if you're trying to drive other people out of business just to get a monopoly. Exclusionary practices, a big one here would be refusal to deal with another party. You say, all right, if you're going to sell me these, you can't deal with anybody else. That's illegal under Clayton. Tying agreements. This is one that Microsoft got in trouble for some, where you agree to buy one product if you purchase another. And this is not a per se violation. We can look at the effect. This is why Microsoft got away with it for quite a while. If you think about the operating systems that were sold with PCs and laptops, it was almost exclusively Windows. Now I know there's a ton of other things out there that people use, but realistically 80-90% of the American market was Windows because it was tied to the sale of these. So Windows would come to, a maker of the market like Lenovo. Of course, Lenovo was IBM then. Or it would come to Dell and would say, put our operating system on and we'll sell it at this price. We'll tie them together. Mergers, now those are controlled under Section 7. We don't want to create either horizontal, vertical monopolies if it's going to really affect market concentration. And we'll talk about conglomerates in 1 second. So what's a horizontal and a vertical merger? Horizontal, if we go back to if we go back to that older model, if you are merging and after the merger there's little or no competition, that's a per se violation. If you raise market share to the point of monopoly per se. Now, we do have guidelines. We use what's called the HHI, or the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, which gives you a formula that says, okay, if you're above this level of market control, it's a bad horizontal merger if you're below this level. Vertical mergers, we tend to use rule of reason to see if it makes sense, if it doesn't impact competition. We generally let vertical mergers go forward much easier. Conglomerates, there's really three types here that we look at. The market extensions, product extensions, and diversifications. If you seek to sell in a new market by buying an established firm, that's usually okay. If it's a new market for you, if you've not been competing in that market and the other person's not. Product extension, if you add a related product to an established line by buying a firm, that can be a conglomerate. And diversification, which is really the most common thing we think about when we think about a conglomerate, where you merge to give a buffer for market fluctuation. So the classic example here is baby food and coffins. If you think about generational cycles, which used to be much stronger, you would have a lot of children at some point in a generation, in a timeline. And then those children would age. There would not be a lot of children. All of a sudden, 20 years later, you'd have a lot of old people because those children have grown up. They would need coffins. So if you had a conglomerate that owned coffins and baby food, well, there were lots of children, it would make money on its baby food. Well, there were lots of old people dying, it would make money on the coffins. And in between, it would be a nice mix. That's diversification at a very simple level. And that's usually okay, by the way. We usually don't get too upset about that type of diversification. Interlocking directorates was banned in Section 8, which you can't sit on two or more boards. So you couldn't necessarily sit on the Ford Motor Company and Chryslers and GMs and AMCs, which had been something that had been done. They would say, well, look, there's 5 firms competing. Just so happens that I'm on all 5 boards and I'm the majority shareholder. You can't do that. Enforcement. Who enforces Sherman and Clayton? Well, there's really 2 big players here, DOJ and FTC. Now, this is a political issue. If you have a very corporate-friendly Department of Justice, which again, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but it tends to be Republicans. If you have a very friendly corporate structure, they usually will allow more mergers without problems. If you have a somewhat hostile structure, they might go after a little bit more. But having said that, that's not a democratic approach. In fact, there's not a lot of evidence to show that there's much of an interest in antitrust at the federal level, period, for the last 20, 30 years. If you think about, here's one of the most notorious creation of monopolies. There were 2 satellite radio providers in the United States, Sirius and XM. And they got together and they said, we want to merge. Well, you think about that, you're going to wind up with essentially 100% of the market. And that would seem to be an obvious per se violation. You look at the HHI index. But DOJ said, no, it's okay because we need satellite radio and there's terrestrial radio to compete against it. And it's just like, okay, we'll let it go. So it doesn't tend to be as enforced, although I think this might change at some point because there's a lot of rumblings about how companies like Amazon and Facebook and Google have so much power that maybe it's time to divest them. So what can they do? They can get you to divest or give up functions. They can dissolve you. They can actually close down a business. Private parties also have the right to sue, particularly under Clayton, because Clayton's not handled criminally. You've got to prove there is an injury, and you got to prove it impacted your business, and then in theory you can collect up to 3 times the damages. But in practice, since you're often attacking a very large, very rich firm, these lawsuits tend to get settled out of court and are difficult. Okay, now I'm going to give you a listing of some exempt firms. These are firms that are not under this. And the first one there is labor unions. Remember, I told you that traditionally the courts were so hostile to labor unions that they used Sherman and regular common laws to claim that any labor union was a restraint on trade and break them. So they are under federal statute now exempt. Labor unions can organize. Agriculture and fisheries, of course, and you've heard this ad nauseum from me. Farmers and fishers get exemptions from many, many laws. This used to be much more important when a significant percentage of the American population was a farmer. Now, somewhat ironically, there's not a lot of small producing farmers. Most farmers, you have some very, very large agricultural companies, but they have some of this exempt protection. Insurance, they managed to carve out their own. They're also regulated a few places. Foreign trade, we feel like if we're in competition with foreign trade, they don't get it. Baseball, this is a kind of a weird one, but essentially, if you go back and you read the cases about baseball, much of this was framed in the early part of the 20th century when baseball was the national sport. And if you had a town like Raleigh, North Carolina, there wasn't one semi-professional baseball team like the Durham Bulls next door, or the Catfish, or whatever they're called. There was probably 10 in Wake County. And you read these opinions, and it's like reading Field of Dreams. They were just exempt. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, several members of the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court were amateur baseball players. Oil marketing is exempt. They are supposedly regulated someplace else. Research and production is exempt. Lobbying of the government is exempt. That's free speech. Defense, state acts, regulated business, federal agencies. Those are exempt. By the way, we're currently in the middle of, at least when I'm doing this, I guess hopefully the end of the pandemic with COVID. The Defense Production Act falls under this, where the government can essentially say, we're going to create a monopoly. You guys can have a monopoly, make this vaccine, or make this tank, make this gun. We don't care about it. Okay. One more point here to talk about. Foreign antitrust. If the United States has had less and less and less of an appetite for regulating our domestic industries, we've had more of an interest in regulating other countries coming in. We are not interested in regulating our companies overseas getting monopolies. We're pretty happy with that. So, if you go to Europe or you go to Asia, again, companies like Microsoft, which are American companies, at least initially, have essential monopolies in certain fields. Well, we had very little interest in regulating it, but the Europeans, interestingly enough, have been. So in the last few years, Intel has been fined by the Europeans $1.44 billion. Microsoft has paid $2 billion in fines for anti-competitive behavior in the last 10 years. The other thing we're starting to see is some of these Asian firms are sniffing around. I do think what will be of interest is if Japanese manufacturing always kind of went through this, but I think Chinese manufacturing, Korean manufacturing kind of been through it a little bit. Chinese is next. As their industries mature and you get Chinese automobile companies that are coming into the American market and really kind of function much like monopolies because they've got a huge domestic, I think you might see more of an appetite for American regulation of foreign companies coming in that could drive out American companies and create trusts or monopolies. I think then you might see it revive. I also think, and I think this is fair, if you look at the rhetoric from some of the political parties, both on the left in the United States, you could call them, say, the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, and on the right in the Republican Party, you could call that, I guess, the Donald Trump wing of the Republican Party. They're both often critical of very large businesses. So Sanders is, we'll call that the progressive wing. The progressive wing often talks about how powerful business is and why some companies need to be broken up. Amazon is often a favorite whipping boy there. And on the right, you will often hear things like, well, Facebook is unfair to conservatives. and it needs to be broken up. And of course, you can even go further. The kind of lunatic fringe will say things like, well, Microsoft is this monopoly that's going to be implanting genetic markers into your bloodstream when they give you these fake vaccines. I mean, there's some real strange conspiracy theories, but I think it shows you the appetite for maybe using antitrust for things that you might not initially think of. Okay, having said that, that's about a half an hour. That's what I like to keep them. So we'll move on to the next chapter whenever you're ready. Have a good evening.